Hello, my name is Bernd Stahl, and in this lecture today I will talk about computer ethics in the Human Brain Project. The reason I'm talking about this is that this is an area of research that I've been engaged in for a while. I'm a professor at Montfort University, which is in Leicester in the UK, and here I lead a research group which is called the Center for Computing and Social Responsibility. So this group has been doing research around ethics and IT for the last 20 odd years. And many of the research topics we've covered are relevant to the Human Brain Project. I am also, within the Human Brain Project, the ethics manager. And as part of my remit there, I have to look after all the ethical issues and the way they are considered and dealt with. So this lecture today is one of a group of lectures, all of which are somewhere in the area of ethics and responsible innovation. And in addition to this one, I will also give another lecture on the issues of ethics management. What I will cover today in this lecture is, I will start with the question of why computer ethics is relevant to the HBP. I will then say a few words about ethics in general, about the concept of ethics, and then I will go firstly through current discourses on ethics and computing as you find them in the academic literature. And in the following step, I will talk about what we can expect in the future. So what are likely emerging ethical issues of new ICTs. I will then briefly talk about a framework for responsible innovation in ICT, and I will end up with a very brief discussion of what that means for people who are working in the HBP, such as yourself in the audience. So why computer ethics in the HBP? If you look at the HBP, it's generally perceived as a very neuroscience-oriented project, which of course is correct. But if you look at the funding structure, it is in fact an ICT project. It is funded by the ICT flagship program. So it doesn't come from the medical or neuroscience side. The funding of the project at least doesn't, but it comes from ICT. And if you look at the content of the HBP, you'll see that there are numerous different ways in which ethics can arise or ethical issues can arise, and various ethical things that can become relevant. So among them, there are things that you would expect, such as biomedical ethics, so ethics having to do with medicine, the treatment of patients, the consequences of new developments, as well as neuroethics, which is a more recent offspring, I would argue, of neuroethics. There are also, however, other sources of ethical concerns and ethical issues that are of relevance here. One of them has to do with social expectation. So the HBP is a very big project which takes up a lot of public funding, and of course society has expectations towards this, which can raise concerns and questions. A further really important area is that of professionalism. So both scientists and technical developers tend to be or consider themselves as professionals. That means that they come from a context within which expectations are defined, and certain activities are typically assumed or promoted. So as a software developer, for example, you have certain sorts of obligations towards your customers, but also towards society as a whole. So this sort of professional background can inform ethical issues. And then I've put this as the last one here, but it's by no means exclusive. Then there are questions of ethics that arise specifically from computers. So what this means is that there are lots of ethics, or there are lots of possible ethical questions and issues within the HBP, which can come from various different areas and perspectives, but one of them is computing, and therefore it's worthwhile knowing something about the relationship between ethics and computing in order to understand what the ethics of the HBP may be. So what do we mean by ethics? Ethics as a term is very old. It's been part of philosophy for several millennia, and there are lots and lots of different definitions of what it means and what it covers. What I suggest here, just to give you an insight into the complexity of the term, is a model of the term ethics which has different levels. So if you look at this slide, you see that it starts with the question of what I've called moral intuition, the question of what's right and what's wrong. So ethics in general has to do with the question of right and wrong, good or bad, desirable or undesirable behavior. And I would say at the basis of that is this moral intuition, namely that in most cases you will know in most situations that you find yourself in what's right and what's wrong. And that comes through various mechanisms. It comes through the culture that you've grown up with, in your socialization and so on. And it's a general fact of life that we typically have intuitions of what's right or wrong. However, they don't always cover everything, which is why at some point we need to explicitly reflect on them. So we have to think about the question, why is a particular type of action right, or why would it be wrong? And that's where we get into what I've called explicit morality. Explicit morality stands for a set of statements, a set of beliefs of what we think to be right and wrong, which we can formulate. So it's something like do not beat children or be friendly to elderly persons. Those are what I would call expressions of explicit morality. Those are the things that we know are right or wrong. Again, this covers the vast majority of our everyday environments and experiences, but in some cases it doesn't. In some cases those various moral intuitions and explicit moralities may clash, or they may lead to areas where it's not clear how they're to be applied. That's where we come to ethical theory. Ethical theory reflects on those explicit moralities and tries to systematize them, try to make them consistent. That's what we typically mean by ethics in terms of philosophical ethics. So that's what ethicists think about. Questions such as, what is it that makes an action right? Is it something to do with the consequences? Is it something to do with the character of the agent? What is it? What are the criteria according to which we make such judgments? And then on top of that, at the highest level, we have what I've called here reflection and meta-ethics. So this is the abstract reflection on ethical theory. So why am I telling you all this? Because it's important to understand that the term ethics just means a lot of different things, and it's very difficult to analytically keep those apart, but it's even more difficult to keep them apart in practice. So when we say something is ethical or unethical in a particular context, then what we should first do is think about in what sense do we mean that, what makes it ethical or unethical, and how does that fit within our general social rules and in the reflective rules, so in the sense of how would we justify the statement that something is good or bad. I think this is important to understand because in the HBP we've got those many ethical issues, and I think some of them touch on various levels of what I've just introduced here, and depending on what they touch on, there may be different ways of dealing with them. The next question, probably worth briefly going over, is, well, do we need a computer ethics in the first place? Do we need ethical considerations specifically to IT or ICT, whatever you want to call it? Or is that just something that is part of normal ethical life? Within the field of computer ethics, which does exist as an academic interest area or discipline, that's a long discussed question. And there are different views on this. So some people would say, no, ethics is ethics. And you can apply ethics to different things. You can apply it to medicine, you can apply it to computing, you can apply it to cars, to whatever you want. But it's always the same ethics. And while I have a lot of sympathy for that position, I think the counter position is also to some degree convincing, namely that there are certain aspects of computing which are different from most, if not all, other technologies, and that these can raise specific ethical issues that are worth exploring. So what might these be? I'll give you a selection of those. One of them is the speed of innovation. If you invent something in traditional engineering, then it takes a long time to filter through until it has some sort of societal consequence. Those consequences may be large, but you typically have a lot of time between the initial invention and the social consequences. But this is not true anymore for IT. And a good example of that is if you think about the current IT environment. If you write an app today, it can go viral tomorrow and change the world significantly. The same thing may be true with new business models, with new ways of socially interacting and so on. So the speed of innovation is quite unique for ICT. The next point is what's been called logical malleability. And that means that the way in which it is predictable whether an IT system is going to be used to a certain purpose or not is very difficult to ascertain. So while all artifacts, all tools, everything we use in this world is subject to different interpretations, different uses. This is specifically so for IT. So coming back to a traditional example, if you have a hammer, there are lots of different things you can use a hammer for. So you can use a hammer to drive a nail into the wall, to repair your car, depending on the car, or possibly also to kill somebody. So in that sense, even a hammer is malleable in its uses. But at the same time, it's much more defined in terms of what you can do with it. For computers as multi-purpose machines, that is very difficult to constrain. So how a computer and a program and a system is used is even less determined by the artifact than it is in most other cases. ICT is pervasive. At this point, certain ICT artifacts, notably the internet, are available all over the world, which also has ramifications for the other points I've already mentioned. So the speed of innovation, for example, is linked to the fact that IT is now all over the place. There are issues around embedded algorithms. So IT is not one single artifact, but it's a combination of various interlinking systems. And even if you're a very highly specialized IT expert, you will not normally understand all the artifacts and all the algorithms which are working within the environment that you're using. So it's very difficult to say that you really understand how your compiler compiles your source code into an executable program. And then even if the executable program is running, the algorithms within it may interact among each other, and they may interact with the other IT environment in which they find themselves in. That contributes to the difficulty of predicting the outcomes of IT. Now, if something goes wrong, it's often very difficult to see why that happened, which is why debugging is something that IT experts spend a lot of time with. Mediating personal interactions means that IT in the modern world changes the way we interact with other people. So the fact, for example, that you're looking at me through a video camera and on a screen rather than looking at me in person shows that our relationship is already different. And you see the example here of a pregnant woman who uses some sort of IT sensor to find out information about the baby. That means that all of a sudden there is a mediated relationship between what might be one of the most intimate human relationships, which has come about through the use of IT. And finally, there is the problem of many hands, which means that because IT is a distributed technology which is worked on and developed by many, many different people across many different environments, it's very difficult to draw clear lines of causality between an outcome and a cause. And often it's practically impossible, and arguably in some cases it's even conceptually impossible. So these are some examples of why people would argue that IT is just a different type of technology from other technologies and therefore warrants a particular attention to ethics. Which is why ethics in computing has been discussed for quite a long while. And you see here two examples of two of the founding scholars who contributed to what we could call computer ethics. You see on the left, Norbert Wiener, who was one of the fathers of digital computing as we know it, and who very early in the 1940s already noticed that IT has or can have consequences which require ethical reflection. So he, in a book written in the 1950s already, foresaw the possibility that people will become unemployed because of widespread IT, a long time before the advent of the PC. And on the right, you see Joseph Weizenbaum, who's another MIT professor who worked on computing in the 1950s and 60s. And he's famous for devising a program called ELIZA. And the idea behind ELIZA was that it was a conversational agent. So you could type something in and the program would respond to you. In a very simple way, it would just bounce back some of the keywords that you used. What Weizenbaum was very surprised by was the fact that a lot of people liked this program and actually thought this might be something that could be used for psychotherapy. So you have a conversation with your computer and your computer understands you. And he very strongly opposed this and said this is transgressing a boundary. This is making a machine do something which machines simply shouldn't do. So these are two examples of early concerns about ethics in computing a long time before computers became as mainstream as they are today. Then throughout the 80s, well, 70s, 80s, and 90s, the field grew. More and more people got attracted to it. At this point, many IT professional societies require ethics to be taught as part of their accreditation. So that's true, for example, in Britain for the British Computer Society. The model curriculum of the ACM requires engagement with ethics professional bodies generally require an ethical commitment, so they have ethical codes and so on. So at this point, I would argue that there's a clear link between ethics and computing. People understand that computing raises ethical issues that need to be addressed. But what are they? What I'll present to you now is a paper published in the ACM computing surveys, where we looked at the discourse in computing and ethics over a 10-year period from 2003 to 2012. And really what we try to do is we try to find out what does the mainstream academic literature say about computers and ethics. The background to this is that we weren't sure how widespread the discourse is, what people understand by this, because the computer ethics community itself publishes in certain venues and has certain ways of communicating that not necessarily translate to, for example, computer scientists or software engineers in general. So what we try to do is we try to go to normal mainstream publicly available journal papers and see what is published in them about ethics in computing. On this slide, you see the distribution of papers that we could find. So I don't have the time to go through the methodology of the paper, and there's a link to the paper at the end of this presentation. But what you can see from this is that there clearly seems to be a trajectory of growing attention. So we have more and more papers as time goes on, which would indicate that there's a growing interest in questions of ethics in computing. What did we do? How did we analyze those papers? So we went through several of the mainstream databases, did various keyword searches for ethics in computing in various combinations, and we came up with, in the end, about 600 papers that discussed in a meaningful way something to do with ethics in computing. And in order to analyze, in order to find out what this discourse says, we came up with a typical structure of the paper that we could imagine a paper to have. So we assumed that, and this is in the center here, that there had to be some sort of ethical issue, some key concern, something that is ethical that people are worried about, that the paper wants to discover. Secondly, we thought it's reasonable to assume that there's going to be some sort of description of the technology. So what is the technology that raises the ethical issue, or where does it play out? We assumed that the paper on ethics and IT would also cover something around ethical theory, so on what basis are ethical claims made. And then the right and bottom points here are more structure of the paper, so we assumed there would have to be a methodology on the basis of which statements are made. We assumed that there might be a contribution that the paper explicitly reflects on, and there would be recommendations, some sort of practical outcome. So these were our main areas of analysis, and then we went through each of the papers and coded each paper in terms of those 6 main points to find out what is it that is discussed and how is it discussed in that. This led to quite a complex picture. So for example, in terms of ethical issues, we found around 1,300. And in order to be able to deal with them, we then structured and categorized them. So what you see here is an example of the level of analysis of technology. You see, for example, that under technology we have certain sub-headings of technology. Examples here: artificial intelligence, internet technologies, generic computing. And then under internet technologies, we again have subheadings such internet, e-commerce, e-services, and so on. And then these are broken down again. This allowed us to deal with the complexity and the richness of the data and still make some sort of sense of it. So if you look at the overall number of codes we found, not surprisingly, the biggest one is in issues. Those are the ethical issues, that the center of the slide I showed you earlier. So we found there is 1,133 unique codes. The other things, or the other components here, are less developed. So technologies, for example, we only found 354, and so on. The least one, or the one with the least content, was methodology. And as you can see, we had 600 papers. We have 1,100 ethical issues. There's not a one-to-one relationship. A lot of papers talked about more than one ethical issue in some sort of sense. So what are the ethical issues? Well, there are lots of them, and this here, this graphic shows you a distribution over time of the various ethical issues. See, the biggest one for most of the time is the red curve on the top, which is what we call the social and practical issues, and I'll come back to what that means a bit later. The second one are core ethical issues, and those were the ones that we thought were possibly most interesting. But you see that there are also other areas. So there's a lot of discussion of legal issues which have an ethical connotation. Some of them are technical issues where the technology itself raises ethical issues per se. And in some cases, interestingly, there weren't any ethical issues, but those were, I would argue, outliers. So what are the core ethical concepts? By core ethical concepts, we meant those ethical questions that arise specific concern and that are very clearly linked to IT and that have a body of discussion around them that already exists. And not surprisingly, if you look at this diagram, you see that almost half of the papers that we looked at least mentioned privacy. So privacy is and remains the big issue. So we had 45% of all the papers covered privacy. There are, at the same time, some less pronounced but also still very visible ones. There's, for example, agency and autonomy are key issues. And then we have others which are slightly less pronounced. This slide shows you what the social and practical issues are. So that's the red line in the previous slide. If you look at that, what we try to collect here are things where we thought there are identifiable social concerns which link to ethical issues in computing. And not surprisingly for those interested in the way computing is structured, the biggest group here are issues to do with professionalism. So within the mainstream literature, there is quite a bit of discussion of how professionalism and ethics relate and what they do and in what way they influence IT. There are also some other ones. So informed consent is something highly discussed. We have a lot of discussion of health-related issues and aging-related issues, and also quite a bit around digital divides. And of course, I could go into a lot more depth, but firstly, I haven't got the time, and if you want to read the paper, please feel free to do so. What are the technologies that people talk about? So I've just covered all the various ethical issues. What technologies do they link to? Well, you see again, there's a large group of those, various different ones. Interestingly, the biggest one is what we call the generic computing. So this is where a paper talks about unethical issues that computing raises or ICT raises. And it doesn't specify in any more detail what exactly it is that the problem or where the problem arises. Which surprised us because when we started this review, thought that it would be more likely that we find the majority of papers linked to specific technologies, but there's quite a bit around very generic technologies. The second biggest group is, again, relatively generic. It's internet technologies. And then the possibly biggest specific technology is artificial intelligence, and of course that is also, or can be broken down in various other technologies. So given that this first overview is not particularly enlightening, we looked at the next level. So we moved into the next level of granularity to find out whether we could find anything there, any particular technologies that are more pronounced, more interesting. But actually the picture doesn't change dramatically. So you see that the biggest technology on that level is the internet. There still is quite a lot around ICT, which is fairly generic. Software, the same thing. And then the first one, where I think it becomes a bit more specific, is robotics. The next one, artificial intelligence. This is something, we finished the data analysis for this paper about 3 years ago, and I would argue that if you looked at the literature right now, it's probably much higher because artificial intelligence and robotics have made a huge impact over the last year or two. With all sorts of activities arising because people are worried about the next steps in AI. Okay, so we now got the ethics, or the ethical issues. We've got the technologies. The next question is, what ethical theories do the papers use to discuss these things? And it turns out that the biggest group there are what we've called ethical theories linked to individuals. So those are big name philosophers typically who have developed an ethical approach and which are then applied in those papers. So those are things like Kantianism, It's utilitarianism as linked to Bentham or Mill, or anything that you might have come across if you've ever looked at philosophical ethics. The second biggest one were general moral principles, where the argument is that there is some sort of moral principle, something like justice, and where people then look at what does that mean, how does it play out in terms of IT. We've got a lot of stuff around ethical theories, which again leads us back to traditional philosophical ethics. And we've got WIT, which is specific on or specific to computer ethics, where there are some ethical theories which are recognizable. What follows from that? What do the authors tell us? What are the recommendations? Well, given that these are mostly research papers, it may not be surprising that the biggest bunch of recommendations are to do further research. That's then followed by education and training. So the idea is people need to understand issues better. And then a lot of other recommendations around policy development, theory development, and so on. What's striking from my perspective on this is that there's relatively few literature, or relatively little literature out there where the authors argue for a specific solution to a specific problem. So there's a lot more general discussion of ethical issues than there is suggestions on what to do about them. And this, I think, is my last slide about this particular issue, where we look at the distribution of codes. So this goes back to the earlier one about what is the content of a paper. And you see that almost all the papers, 99%, had an ethical issue. The majority of them discovered or discussed technologies, but very little, or relatively few, less than half of them actually used an ethical theory, which again we find surprising, assuming that if you write about ethics, you should have ethics as a term in there. And also very few talked about what their contribution was or what their methodology was, which surprised us as well. So this was the discourse on ethics in IT from 2003 to 2012. And so we know now that there is a wealth of knowledge about a variety of ethical issues. There still is some very strong ones, some very strongly represented ones, privacy being the lead example, but there is a broad range of ethical issues out there. But what's going to happen in the future? What is likely to be ethics of IT in the next 10, 15, 20 years? But in order to answer this question, we've done a foresight analysis project which was called Etica. Etica stood for Ethical Issues of Emerging ICT Applications. This was an EU project which ended a couple of years ago, but you can still see the findings, the outcomes on the website, and you see the URL here. What we did in the Etica project is we looked at various discourses around emerging and future technologies, information technologies, and we tried to identify which individual technologies are likely to be socially relevant in 10 to 15 years. The end result of that identification process was that we came up with 11 core technologies which we thought were represented in the discussion. And then we did an ethical analysis for each of those by, again, looking at the literature, this time the literature on ethics in IT, to find out what people said about these various technologies. You can have a look at these technologies on the website. What I'll do very briefly here is I'll do an overview of shared ethical issues that came up in more than one technology, often in all of those technologies, to give an indication of what people expect there to be in terms of ethical issues in the future. Now, we've distinguished here between predictable ethical issues and less predictable ones. The predictable ones are the ones that we already know about. Those are the issues that we currently deal with, but we know that they're going to stay and we know that they're going to be worse in the future. And the key one, not surprisingly, given everything I've said so far, is privacy. So we know privacy is an issue now. We know it's going to be an issue in 10 years. But there are things that are going to change. So not only will there be new types of data, so data we currently have, we currently don't have. An example of that would be something like emotional data. So there is a whole field, sometimes called affective computing, where people try to measure human emotions, represent them in machines, and have machines express human emotions. that may lead to all sorts of data protection concerns that we currently don't have yet. In addition to the type of data and the quantity of data, there will also be new ways of linking and interacting data. So there'll be new ways of drawing inferences from data that we currently don't have, all of which may raise issues around privacy. There's security, which is a key issue that the IT industry at the moment is very worried about. Same is true for trust. Certainly in Europe, after the Snowden revelation, trust is something that has been an issue for the ICT field as a whole. When citizens and consumers started to notice that even Western governments are spying on them, it dawned on people that the current use of IT is probably worth reflecting on. There are issues around liability. So if we live in this future ambient, all interconnected world, if something goes wrong, whose fault it is, who's going to be liable, who's going to be responsible, which at this point is not necessarily clear. And then there are issues around digital divides, the haves versus the have-nots, which can play out on a global scale, but can also be an issue more locally. Now, all of these are issues we know about, and we are currently trying to deal with more or less successfully. In addition, there are also various issues that are now popping up, which we may also know about, but which we haven't got a good vocabulary to talk about yet. And key among those, and I think specifically relevant to the HBP, is the question of the view of humans. So what is it that constitutes a human, and how does IT change that? So these are issues, for example, around therapy and enhancement. At what point is a therapy, or is an IT intervention a therapy? And for example, you can think of various implants, deep brain stimulation. Those are IT artifacts being used in direct conjunction with human beings, which have therapeutical purposes. But at the same time, then the question is, well, if those things work, at what point do they become an enhancement? And is that a problem? Many people have the intuition that therapy is okay, enhancement is a problem, but that raises all sorts of interesting questions around the boundaries and why we would see this as problematic. Related to this are questions around normality. What do we consider to be normal? What can we expect from each other? But also questions around mortality. This can lead from very simple questions about digital inheritance, who is going to own my Facebook page after I'm dead and so on, to all the way a transhumanist view of we can upload our mind and live forever in the cloud. All of these are questions that have to do with identity. So my view of myself and our collective view of ourselves on an individual level. At the same time, new emerging ICTs are likely to change power relationships. So the way in which we can collect data about other people will change the way in which they can influence us or we can influence them. And think about an employer who has access to your emotional well-being data. The very moment that that employer has that sort of data, the power structure changes. Not necessarily for the worse, but something to think about. Environmental issues are a huge concern. ICT at this point is said to consume about 5% of the world power consumption. That is rising steadily, but at the same time, of course, ICT can be used to reduce environmental degradation by saving energy and so on. And the last one, and I think that's probably the most interesting one and also the most difficult one, is what does all of this do to our societies? What does this do to our cultures? How does the fact that we now, many of us are always on, always interconnected, always very easy to reach, how does that change the dynamics and the nature of the relationships that we live in? How does the fact that we can now much more choose who we want to be linked with, and that we can spend a lot of time with our friends on Facebook on the other side of the world, a lot less time with our neighbors next door, how does that change the way we collectively interact, see ourselves, and plan our futures? I'm not saying that all of this is bad. I'm saying that this raises all sorts of interesting questions about the future of how we live our lives. What you see on this slide is an attempt to map the various ethical issues to the HBP. So what I've talked about so far is past discourse on computers and ethics. I've talked about what we can expect in the future. And what you see here is an attempt to collect and summarize all the various ethical issues in the HBP. So this is what we've called the ethics map, and then I'll talk a lot more about this in the other lecture I'm going to give, the one on ethics management. This slide here is clearly too small for you to see, which is why I've blown up some of the main points. But I would say that probably about half of the ethical issues that are on this map, which is supposed to represent the ethical issues in the HBP that we think about, probably about half of them are computer related or have specific issues to do with IT, the processing of data, or the use of data. So the first one here is personal data concern, which is most obvious probably in the question of the use of patient data, which is what SP8 does, and the question of secondary use of clinical data. But it's by no means only an SP8 issue, so no means only a medical informatics platform issue. There are also data protection issues in other areas of the HBP, so for example, where data is collected from humans for research purposes, but also questions around data protection in high-performance computing. This one here, the next one, is then the question of the use of data and the input of data from various other sources into the HBP. And you see two examples here, the data sharing with China and data sharing with Australia. Both of these are animal related, and of course animals have no privacy concerns, but there are still potential ethical issues with the use of data which may or may not have been created using ethical standards of the EU, and the question of who's responsible for ensuring that this has been the case, so that the animal data has been gained in an ethical manner. We see a lot of concerns about dual use. So dual use is the use of technology for military purposes. And that's something that most of the platforms, so most of the technical outputs of the HBP are affected by. So you see here the examples of neuromorphic computing, neurorobotics, high-performance computing, and also of brain simulation. In various ways, all of these may be interesting to the military, military use of technology or research outcomes is generally prohibited by the EU. So a condition of funding by the European Union is that it's not used for military purposes. But that raises the question, how do we know whether that's the case? How can we enforce it? How can we make sure the military doesn't use this stuff? There are what I've called remote issues, so issues that are further in the future. So these fall under the heading of the emerging ICTs. Things like robot ethics. Is there a point at which we would describe some sort of ethical agency to a robot? Questions about human identity, which I've covered earlier, and human self-understanding. So what is it that determines us? And arguably the HBP has the potential, by enhancing our understanding of how the brain works and how humans function, to change the way in which we see ourselves. There are issues around misuse, so questions of data security, how to make sure that the data we hold within the HBP is not used for nefarious purposes. And again, that can be done, or that can be a threat for various types of technologies. Okay, so this was my attempt to link what I've said earlier, the ethics in computing with the HBP. What should we do about this? What should you do about this? Or what can be done about it? Part of the answer to this comes under the heading of responsible research and innovation. There will be a separate presentation in this lecture series on responsible innovation. What I want to do very briefly is run through the results of a UK project which has a specific view of what responsible innovation is, to explain how that can be used in order to understand and deal with ethical issues in IT. So this comes from the UK Framework for Responsible Innovation ICT project, and we tried to develop a framework that's applicable to people who use computers, who employ computers, in order to identify ethical issues and find ways of dealing with them. This is based on the RRI Framework. RRI stands for anticipation, reflection, engagement, and action, which is a framework that was developed by Richard Owen and his collaborators, and which was used or implemented by the UK Engineering and Physical Science Research Council. So the idea is that in order to act responsibly in research and innovation, you should anticipate, so think about the outcomes of the research, reflect on the purpose, the motivation, and the potential implications of the research. So not just try to project, but also think about what it means for you now. Engage, that means talk to various stakeholders. And act, which means do something about the insights you gain. This is a generic framework, and we've tried to make it a bit more specific and relevant to IT by supplementing it with what we call the 4 Ps. The 4 Ps stands for the process, so the process of actually doing research. The product, the outcomes, what's going to be the end of it. The purpose, what are we trying to achieve? Why is the research being done? And the people. So if you take the area and the 4 Ps and put them into a matrix, as you can see here, then you have a number of cells which individually allow you to reflect on particular components of the research. And if you look at this framework as it's shown here, you'll see that there are various questions, what we called scaffolding questions in this matrix. And the idea is that you can work through these, and by answering the questions for your particular research, for your particular topic, for your particular approach, you can then identify which issues there are and which issues should be addressed. So you can now pick any one of those individually, or if you want to be systematic, you can work your way through all of these separately. Now, as I said, there will be a separate lecture on responsible innovation, which touches on aspects of this, because the responsible innovation activity within the HBP are modeled to some degree on this area framework, but they are more broad and not as specific to IT as the one that we've tried to develop here. So, I'm coming to an end. Last slide. What does this mean for people within the HBP? So for a researcher, somebody who is actually doing the scientific side, who is doing the systems development side, what does that mean? How can you deal with this? Well, I think there's no simple answer to this question. There's no algorithm, there's no, you have to do this and everything will be all right that I can give you. But I think what it means is that people within the HBP and generally people working with computers need to understand that it is their responsibility to engage with these questions. That doesn't mean you'll find the perfect answer, but it does mean that thinking about them is something that is part of what constitutes a professional IT researcher. And in fact, I can vouch for the fact that in the HBP, the vast majority of people I've talked with are fully aware of that and very happy to engage with these questions. So I think the HBP is very lively in this regard, and the people from the various technical platforms are very interested in thinking about these questions. So I think that's really the key take-home message. Realize that what is being done in terms of IT development is not value neutral. IT is not a tool where you can say, I'm not responsible for the use of the tool, I'm just making it. While of course there is a certain amount of truth to that, and we can never know all the outcomes and all the possible uses of what we're doing, that does not absolve us from the responsibility of trying to think about what are likely outcomes going to be. If this awareness is there, then that means there needs to be a level of reflection, a way of thinking about what the consequences of your IT developments are. And this is something that, to some degree, you can do alone. An individual researcher might do, but in general, it means it calls for engagement. Engagement means you need to talk to your immediate environment in the first instance, so people in your sub-projects, people like the ethics rapporteurs who we have in all sub-projects in the Human Brain Project, your managers, your colleagues. I think that's where it starts. You can, of course, talk to us, so the sub-project Ethics in Society or the people in ethics management. We're very happy to engage with people in the HBP concerning all sorts of ethical issues, whether they are simple compliance-oriented ones or whether they're very complex, far-out social issues. But it doesn't stop there. I think it's important to also say that this is not just an internal activity of the HBP. This is something that needs to be taken out into society, where we need to engage with users, with patients, with people who are going to be in some way affected by this, and we need to work with them to understand better what consequences of our work will be and how to deal with them. And that was the end of the presentation itself. There are a couple of slides now which have some references to papers and projects which I've touched on. If you have any questions, if you want to pursue this, please contact me. Or, as I said earlier, look at the possible points of engagement and contact within your SP, but also in the HBP as a whole. Thank you very much.